The transport ship dropped out of hyperspace above Cathari Prime, and Elena Vasquez pressed her face against the cold viewport glass to get her first look at the fortress world below. It was ugly, she thought, a brown and gray planet covered in military bases and training grounds that stretched across entire continents. And somewhere down there was the Galactic Union Combined Arms Academy, the most brutal military school in known space, and she was about to walk through its gates as the first human exchange candidate of this training cycle. The shuttle landed hard on a cracked landing pad, and Elena grabbed her kit bag with one hand and dragged the sealed metal crate behind her with the other. The crate was heavy even by human standards, and it contained the only piece of equipment she truly cared about, her Terran Mark IV powered armor. She stepped out into the hot, dry air and immediately felt the stares. There were dozens of alien recruits gathered on the parade ground, species she had only seen in briefing files before now. The Drethkari were the most common, massive reptilian creatures that stood over 7 feet tall, with 4 muscular arms and scales that glinted like dark metal in the sun. They were considered the finest warriors in the galaxy, and they looked at Elena the way a wolf might look at a mouse that had wandered into its den. There were Selvari, too, insectoid beings with 6 legs and compound eyes that clicked and chittered as they watched her pass. And Gorvan, enormous gelatinous creatures from heavy gravity worlds who moved like slow-rolling boulders. And Paleshi, thin, hollow-boned avians with sharp beaks and feathered crests, who perched on railings and watched everything from above. Elena was 5 feet and 7 inches tall, and she weighed about 140 pounds, and next to any of them, she looked like a child who had gotten lost on the way to school. She kept walking. A Drethkari recruit stepped into her path and looked down at her with all 4 arms crossed, and said something in the common trade language that translated roughly to, "Did your species send you as a joke or as a snack?" And the aliens nearby made sounds that Elena understood were laughter. She walked around him without a word, and kept moving toward the barracks. The barracks were long gray buildings with no windows, and bunks stacked 3 high along the walls. Each bunk was sized for species much larger than her. And when Elena found the one assigned to her, she had to climb up to reach it. It was the worst spot in the building, right next to the recycling vents that pumped hot stale air all through the night. And she knew this was not an accident. She had barely set down her kit bag when the doors at the far end of the barracks slammed open, and every recruit in the room went rigid. Sergeant Kale Vorath walked in, and the temperature of the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. He was enormous even for a Drethkari, nearly 8 feet of scaled muscle and barely contained violence. His forearms were scarred from decades of combat and training, and his eyes were the color of old blood. But the thing that drew every eye in the room was the Baton. It was 2 feet of solid ceruleum, a metal alloy rated to crack starship hull plating, wrapped in leather at the grip, and polished to a mirror shine. Vorath carried it the way some creatures carry a part of their own body, like it was simply an extension of his will. He walked the length of the barracks slowly, looking at each recruit, and when he reached Elena, he stopped. He stared down at her for a long time, and she stared back up at him, and neither of them blinked. "You are the human," he said, and his voice sounded like gravel being crushed under a tank. "Yes, Sergeant," Elena said. "The Galactic Union has asked me to train you alongside real soldiers," he said. "I want you to understand something right now. You are here because of politics. You are here because your little species signed a treaty, and the diplomats wanted a token gesture of inclusion. You are not here because anyone believes you belong here." Elena said nothing. Vorath leaned closer, and she could smell the chemical sharpness of his breath, and feel the heat radiating from his scaled skin. "No human has ever graduated from this academy," he said. "I have personally ensured that, and I intend to keep my record clean." "Understood, Sergeant," Elena said, and her voice was steady and flat, and gave away nothing at all. He held her gaze for another moment, and then moved on. barking orders at the rest of the cadre, assigning duties and watches. And Elena noticed that she received the heaviest kit loadout and the longest night watch shifts and the worst meal rotation. And she noted all of it, said nothing about any of it. That night after lights out, Elena lay in her bunk and listened to the sounds of 40 alien recruits trying to sleep, the clicking of Selvari legs, the wet shifting of the Gorvan, the quiet breathing of the Drethkari. And she waited until the barracks was still, before she climbed down and opened her sealed crate. The Mark IV armor lay inside in pieces, matte black and dense, each component nestled in shock foam like the organs of some sleeping predator. She began to assemble it piece by piece on the floor, running diagnostics on the microfusion core and checking the energy diffusion plating and calibrating the joint servos with quiet, practiced hands. A sound made her look up, and she saw Selvari watching her from a nearby bunk, compound eyes glittering in the dim emergency lighting. It was the one assigned to the bunk below hers, a recruit whose file said their name was Chirik. "What are you doing?" Chirik asked in a whispered. "Click, checking my equipment," Elena said. "Why bother?" Chirik said, and there was something in the Selvari's voice that might have been pity. "You will not last the week, human. None of your kind ever do." Elena slotted the chest plate into the back housing and heard the satisfying click of the magnetic locks engaging, and the low hum of the fusion core warming up vibrated through her fingertips. She looked at Chirik, and her expression was calm and unreadable, and she said one thing before she went back to her work. "We will see." Chirik stared at her for a moment longer, and then retreated into their bunk, and Elena continued her work in the dark, alone, patient, and utterly unbothered by anything that had happened or anything that was coming. Somewhere above the barracks the sky of Cathari Prime burned with unfamiliar stars, and Elena Vasquez did not look up at them because she had work to do, and she had never been the kind of person who wasted time on things she could not change, when there were things right in front of her that she could. The drill instructor broke his baton on her armor. The human said, "My turn." The first week nearly killed 3 recruits, and Elena was not one of them. Vorath ran Training Cadre 41 the way a butcher runs a slaughterhouse, with efficiency and no mercy and a deep personal enjoyment of the work. Every morning began before the sun rose, with a 10-kilometer run in full kit across the volcanic flats outside the academy. The ground was sharp and hot, and the air tasted like metal and sulfur. And by the end of the first run, 2 Palashi recruits had collapsed, and a Gorvan had cracked a leg plate and had to be dragged back on a medical sled. Elena finished in the middle of the group, not first, not last, breathing hard but upright, and Vorath watched her cross the finish line with a look of quiet irritation, like he had expected her to be among the fallen, and was personally offended that she was not. The days blurred together after that into a haze of pain and exhaustion and relentless pressure. There were weapons drills where they learned to fire pulse rifles and plasma launchers and magnetic accelerator cannons, and Elena scored average on all of them. Not impressive, not embarrassing, just steady. There were hand-to-hand combat sessions in the sparring pit, where recruits were matched against each other, and Elena fought with a strange, careful efficiency that confused her opponents. She did not try to overpower anyone, because she could not. Instead, she moved and redirected, and used angles and leverage and timing, and she won about half her matches, and lost the other half. And none of her victories were dramatic enough to draw attention. Vorath noticed anyway. He made it his personal mission to break her, and he was creative about it. He assigned her extra watches, so she slept less than anyone else in the cadre. He made her carry additional equipment during marches. He singled her out for criticism during tactical briefings even. When her answers were correct, and when none of that worked, he began using the baton. The first time he hit her was during a formation drill, when she was half a second late on a turn. The cerulean baton came down across her shoulders with a crack that echoed across the parade ground, and Elena staggered forward one step, and then straightened, and resumed her position, without a sound. Blood seeped through her fatigues, where the blow had split the skin, and she did not touch the wound or acknowledge it in any way. He hit her again the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that, always finding some small infraction to justify it. And Elena took every blow the same way. She absorbed it, and she straightened, and she kept going. And something about the way she did it began to unsettle the other recruits, because it was not stubbornness, and it was not numbness. It was something else, something they did not have a word for in their languages. In the 4th week, they ran. The 40-hour endurance march, a continuous forced march across the Cathari highlands with no sleep and no rest stops and minimal water. The trail climbed through volcanic ridges where the rock was sharp enough to cut through boot soles, and descended into valleys filled with toxic gas that required sealed breathing masks. Recruits began to fall within the first 12 hours. A Gorvon named Brelt, who weighed over 500 kilograms, and had boasted on the first day that his species was built for endurance, collapsed at the 20-hour mark, and lay in the dirt, making a sound that everyone understood was weeping, regardless of what species they were. 2 more Peleshi dropped out entirely, and were taken back to the academy on medical transports. A Drethkari recruit named Torvan, who had been assigned as squad leader for the exercise, stopped giving orders around hour 30, and simply walked in silence with empty eyes. Elena kept walking. Could see that. Her feet were bleeding, and her shoulders were bruised purple and black from Voros Baton, and her lips were cracked from dehydration. But she kept walking with the same steady rhythm she had maintained since the 1st kilometer. Not fast, not slow, just constant, like a machine that did not know how to turn itself off. At hour 35, she noticed Chirrut struggling. The Salvari's lower legs were cramping, and their compound eyes had gone dull with exhaustion. And without saying anything, Elena moved beside Chirrut, and took half the weight of the Salvari's pack onto her own shoulders, and kept walking. "Why?" Chirrut managed to ask. "Because you are my bunkmate," Elena said, and that was apparently enough of a reason. They finished the march, all 40 hours of it, and Elena crossed the finish line, carrying her own gear and half of Chirrut's gear, and her face was blank and gray with exhaustion, but she was upright, and she was walking. Squad-level tactical exercise in the 6th week. Something happened that Vorath could not ignore. The cadre was divided into squads and sent into a simulated urban combat zone. Torvan was squad leader again, and when the first volley of simulated enemy fire erupted around them, he froze completely. His forearms locked at his sides, his eyes went wide, and he simply stopped functioning. Elena did not hesitate. She stepped forward and began giving orders in a calm, quiet voice that cut through the chaos like a knife through water. She directed the Salvari to the flanks, positioned the Gorvon as mobile cover, sent the Peleshi up to elevated positions for overwatch, and led the Drethkari in a direct push through the center. It was not flashy, and it was not dramatic. It was just correct. Every decision was the right decision, made at the right time, and delivered with absolute certainty. The squad completed the exercise with the highest score of the entire training cycle. When the results were posted, Vorath credited Torvan as squad leader, and did not mention Elena at all. Nobody in the cadre believed it, but nobody said anything. After the exercise that evening, Vorath found Elena alone in the equipment room, cleaning her rifle, and he stood in the doorway blocking the light, and said, "No human has ever graduated from this academy." Elena looked up at him, and said, "You mentioned that already, Sergeant." His jaw tightened, and something dangerous moved behind his eyes, and he said, "I'm going to make sure you understand what that means." Elena set down her rifle, and stood, and looked directly into his eyes, which was a gesture considered deeply aggressive and challenging among the Drethkari, and she said nothing at all. She just looked at him. Vorath hit her across the jaw with his open hand, and the sound of the impact was loud in the empty room. And Elena's head snapped to the side, and a thin line of blood ran from the corner of her mouth. Her mouth! She turned her head back and looked at him again. She still said nothing. She picked up her rifle and walked past him out of the room, and Vorath stood there alone, in the silence for a long time. And if anyone had been watching, they might have noticed something they had never seen on his face before. It was not anger, it was doubt. And in the barracks that night, Chirik cleaned the cut on Elena's jaw with a medical kit, and asked her how she did it, how she took all of it, and kept going. And Elena thought about it for a while, and then said, "Where I come from, everything is trying to kill you all the time. The weather, the animals, the diseases, even the ground shakes and opens up and swallows cities whole. We do not survive because we are tough. We survive because we decided a very long time ago that we would not stop, no matter what." Chirik considered this, and then asked, "Is that not the same thing as being tough?" Elena smiled, the only times Chirik had ever seen her do it, and said, "Maybe it is." The drill instructor broke his baton on her armor. The human said, "My turn." Week 8 brought the full armor combat evaluation, and every recruit in Cadre 41 knew what it meant, because the older cadres had warned them about it in whispers and with wide eyes. It was the single most important test in the entire training cycle, a pass-or-fail exercise that had ended the careers of more recruits than any other trial at the academy. And at its center was a tradition that had been part of Trethkari military culture for over 1,000 years. The correction circuit. The rules were simple. Each recruit would step into a marked circle on the parade ground wearing their full combat armor, and the drill instructor would strike them with the ceremonial baton. And the recruit would stand at attention and endure it. That was all. It was not a fight. It was a ritual of submission, a demonstration that the instructor held absolute dominance over the recruit. Recruit accepted that dominance without resistance. Vorath stood in the center of the parade ground, with his cerulean baton gleaming in the morning light, and his blood-red eyes moving slowly across the assembled cadre. And Elena could see that he was looking forward to this. The Drethkari recruits went first, because they were the dominant species, and this was their tradition. They stepped into the circle, one by one, and stood rigid as Vorath struck them across the shoulders and chest and back with full force. The baton rang against their natural scaled armor and their additional plating, and most of them bore it well, swaying but not falling, though a few stumbled and one dropped to a knee before catching himself. The Gorvan went next, and their heavy carapace plating cracked and shattered under the blows like ceramic hitting concrete. The one named Brelt took a strike to the chest that sent a web of fractures across his entire front plate, and he made a low moaning sound but stayed on his feet. The Palashi were the worst off. Their lightweight flight armor was designed for speed, not durability, and Vorath's baton tore through it like paper. One Palashi finished the circuit with her chestplate hanging in strips and her feathered crest matted with her own blood. The Selvari recruits endured with their characteristic stoicism, compound eyes blank and bodies rigid as the baton cracked against their chitinous shells. Chirik took 3 hard blows and wobbled, but did not fall. And Elena felt something warm in her chest, watching her friend stand firm. Then it was Elena's turn. She had been standing at the back of the formation, and now the entire cadre watched as she walked to the equipment area and opened her sealed crate. This was the first time most of them had seen her put on the Mark IV in full, and they watched with curiosity, and then with confusion, and then with something that might have been awe. Piece by piece, and each piece sealed to the next, with a magnetic click and a soft hiss of pressurization. The leg plates locked around her calves and thighs. The torso housing wrapped her chest and back. The arm guards slid into place with mechanical precision. The gauntlets closed over her hands with a whir of micro-servos. And when she lifted the helmet and settled it over her head, the entire suit came alive. The microfusion core at the base of her spine hummed to life, and the sound was low and deep and steady like a heartbeat. Blue-white light pulsed once along the seams of the matte black plating, and then dimmed to a faint glow. The energy diffusion layer activated with a shimmer that made the air around the armor ripple like heat haze. And Elena Vasquez walked onto the parade ground, and she was no longer a small, soft human in a galaxy of giants. She was something else entirely. She stepped into the circle and stood at attention, and Vorath looked at her with an expression that mixed contempt with something he probably would not have admitted was curiosity. He struck her across the left shoulder with a standard blow. The baton bounced off the Mark IV's plating, with a clear ringing tone, like a bell being struck in an empty cathedral, and it left absolutely nothing behind, no dent, no scratch, no mark of any kind. The cadre went silent. Vorath's eyes narrowed, and he struck again, harder this time, across the chest plate. And the baton rang again, and bounced again, and the armor was untouched, and Elena had not moved even a fraction of a centimeter. He hit her across the right arm, and then the left arm, and then the back, and then the helmet, and every single blow produced the same result: a clean musical ring, and absolutely no damage. The cerulean baton that was rated to crack starship hull plating could not even scratch the surface of Terran Mark IV-powered armor. Something changed in Vorath's face then, a tightening of the muscles around his jaw, and a hardening of his eyes that the Drethkari recruits recognized as genuine fury. This was no longer a ritual. This had become personal. His authority was embodied in that baton, and his authority was failing in front of every recruit he commanded. He gripped the baton in all four hands, and raised it above his head, and brought it down with every ounce of strength in his massive body, directly onto the top of Elena's helmet. The baton exploded. It did not bend or crack. It shattered. The cerulean alloy broke into a dozen pieces that scattered across the parade ground like shrapnel, and the broken stump of the handle remained in Vorath's upper right hand, and he stared at it as if he could not understand what he was seeing. The silence on the parade ground was the loudest sound Elena had ever heard. 40 recruits and their drill instructor stood frozen in a moment that every single one of them understood was historic. Not just a weapon, it was a symbol. It represented the instructor's absolute authority and the recruit's absolute submission. And it had just disintegrated against a human's armor like it was made of glass. Elena reached up, and her visor retracted with a soft click, and her face was revealed, calm and dark-eyed and completely composed, and she looked at Vorath, and he looked at her, and for the first time since she had arrived at the academy, the power between them was not tilted in his direction. She spoke, and her voice carried across the silent parade ground without effort. "My turn." Nobody breathed, but Elena did not raise a fist. She did not attack. She did not even step toward Vorath. Instead, she reached up and removed her helmet entirely, and held it under one arm, and she turned to face the assembled cadre. "This armor," she said, "was not built to impress anyone. It was not built for ceremonies or rituals or displays of dominance. It was built to keep a human being alive on a planet that has been trying to murder our species since the day we crawled out of the ocean." She looked at the Drethkari and said, "Your homeworld has a stable climate and predictable seasons, and your scales evolved over millions of years in a gentle environment. Earth has ice ages and supervolcanoes and earthquakes that flatten cities and hurricanes that tear apart coastlines, and radiation that mutates every living thing it touches." She looked at the Gorvan and said, "Your world has heavy gravity, and you evolved to be strong and dense to survive it. Humans evolved on a world where the gravity is constantly trying to break our spines and crush our joints, and we built machines to carry the weight instead. She looked at the Peleshi and said, "Your world has open skies and thin air, and you evolved to fly above your problems. Our world has predators in the sky, and predators on the ground, and predators in the water, and we could not fly, could not outrun them, and we could not outfight them. So we learned to outthink them and outlast them." She looked at Vorath and said, "This armor is not a uniform. It is a survival system designed by a species that has been at war with its own planet for 300,000 years. Your baton broke against it because it was built to survive things far worse than a baton." She paused and then said, "You have shown me your way of training soldiers. Domination, submission, pain as a teaching tool. I respect the tradition, even though I do not agree with it. Now I am asking for the chance to show you ours." She looked Vorath directly in the eyes again and said, "Let me design the next combat evaluation. Human rules, human standards, and I will do it alongside every recruit in this cadre, not as an instructor, but as one of you." The parade ground was still, and the wind blew dust across the broken pieces of the cerulean baton. And every pair of eyes was on Vorath, waiting for his response. He could have refused. He could have dismissed her. He could have reasserted his authority through force or rank or tradition. But every recruit was watching, and they had all seen his baton shatter, and they had all heard her speak, and if he refused now, it would look like fear. Vorath dropped the broken stump of the baton handle on the ground, and it clattered against the stone. "Show me," he said. And Elena Vasquez smiled. The drill instructor broke his baton on her armor. The human said, "My turn." Elena spent 12 hours planning the exercise, and when she presented it to Vorath and the cadre in the pre-dawn darkness the next morning, even the Drethkari looked nervous. It was called a combat endurance patrol, and by human military standards, it was actually a fairly standard training exercise. 60 kilometers on foot, through the volcanic highlands of Cathari Prime, carrying full combat loads, under simulated enemy contact the entire way, with a squad-on-squad tactical engagement at the end. No rest breaks, no resupply drops, no medical evacuations unless someone was actually dying. Total time limit, 48 hours. The Drethkari recruits scoffed at first, because they had done long marches before, and 60 kilometers did not sound like much. And then Elena told them the part that made the room go quiet. She would do the entire thing out of her armor. Powered systems, no energy diffusion plating, no microfusion core, just Elena in standard fatigues and boots, carrying the same pack as everyone else, the same weight, the same conditions, no advantages of any kind. Vorath stared at her when she said this, and she could see the calculation happening behind his red eyes. He was trying to decide if this was bravery or stupidity, and she could tell he had not yet reached a conclusion. "You will fail," he said. "Maybe," Elena said, "but I will not stop." They set out at dawn. The first 10 kilometers were deceptive. The terrain was flat, and the air was cool, and the cadre moved in a loose formation with something that almost resembled confidence. The Drethkari set a fast pace with their long, powerful legs, and the Gorvan rumbled along at the rear, and the Peleshi darted ahead as scouts, and Elena walked in the middle of the column, one boot in front of the other, steady and unremarkable. Terrain had changed, and so had the mood. The trail climbed sharply into the highland ridges, where the volcanic rock was jagged and loose, and the air temperature had risen to a point where even the heat-adapted Drethkari were sweating through their scales. The Gorvan were struggling the most. Their massive bodies were designed for flat, heavy-gravity plains, not steep mountain trails, and every step uphill was a battle against their own weight. Elena was suffering too, and she made no effort to hide it. Sweat soaked through her fatigues, and her breathing was labored, and her face was red from the heat and the exertion. But her feet kept moving at the same pace they had maintained since the first step. Not faster, not slower, just constant. At kilometer 30, they descended into a valley filled with thin, toxic gas, that required breathing masks. And the trail narrowed to a ledge, barely wide enough for the Gorvon to pass single file. A Paleshi recruit, named Seva, froze at the edge of the ledge, her avian instincts screaming at her to fly, but her wings pinned under her pack, and she could not move forward, and she could not move back. Elena worked her way forward through the column until she reached Seva, and she did not shout or give orders. She simply stood next to the Paleshi and said, "Look at me, not at the drop, just look at me and walk where I walk." And then she turned and walked along the ledge with calm, measured steps, and Seva followed her, eyes locked on the back of Elena's head, and they crossed the ledge together. At kilometer 40, Chiric's legs began to fail. The Selvari's lower joints were not designed for sustained bipedal marching over rough terrain, and the muscles had cramped so badly that each step was visibly agonizing. Chiric slowed, and then stumbled, and then nearly fell, and Elena was there before anyone else. She took Chiric's pack off the Selvari's back and added it to her own, without a word. Weight of any other recruit in the cadre, and she was doing it without powered armor on a body that was already exhausted. "You cannot carry that," Chiric said. "Watch me," Elena said. Vorath was marching with them because his pride had demanded it, and Elena could see that he was watching everything. He watched her carry Chiric's pack. He watched her talk Seva across the ledge. He watched her help a Gorvan named Brelt find footing on a steep descent by bracing herself against a rock and letting the massive alien use her shoulder as a handhold. And his expression was unreadable, but his eyes never left her. At kilometer 50, with the cadre strung out along a ridge and the sun hammering down on them without mercy, Torvan, the Drethkari, who had frozen during the earlier tactical exercise, fell into step beside Elena and asked her a question that had been forming in his mind for weeks. "How do you keep going?" he asked. And he was not asking about the march, was asking about everything. The Baton strikes, the insults, the isolation, the 40-hour marches, all of it. Elena was quiet for several steps, and then she said, "Humans are persistence predators. Do you know what that means?" Torvan shook his massive scaled head. "It means that on our world, we did not evolve to be fast enough to catch our prey in a sprint. We could not outrun the animals we needed to eat. So instead, we chased them. We followed them at a walking pace for hours and hours and hours until they collapsed from exhaustion, because they could not cool their bodies the way we could. They would sprint away, and we would walk after them. They would sprint again, and we would walk after them. And eventually they would fall down and not get back up, and we would still be walking." She looked at him and said, "We are not the strongest species, and we are not the fastest, and we are not the toughest, but we do not stop, ever. That is what we are." Torvan was quiet for a long time after that. They reached the 60-kilometer mark, and the staging area for the tactical engagement, as the sun was setting, and the cadre was a ragged, broken line of exhausted aliens, and one small human woman, who was bleeding from her feet, and sunburned across her face and neck, and shaking with fatigue, but still walking at the same steady pace she had maintained since the beginning. The tactical exercise was squad against squad, Elena's team against Torvan's team. Non-lethal training rounds, last squad standing wins. Torvan's team was larger, and had more Drethkari, which meant more raw combat power. Elena's team had Chiric and Brelt and Seva, and a mix of species that should have been a disadvantage. It was not. Elena fought the way humans fight, when the rules are survival instead of honor. She used deception and misdirection and terrain and improvised traps and psychological pressure. She had Seva climb to a high position and make noise to draw attention, while Chiric's squad flanked from the east. She had Brelt charge the center as a distraction, while she personally crawled through a drainage ditch to get behind Torvan's command position. She used rocks, and dust, and shadows, and noise, and silence. And when Torvan finally realized what was happening, his entire squad had been eliminated in under 4 minutes. He stood in the fading light, with training paint splattered across his chest, and looked at Elena, who was covered in mud and blood and dust, and grinning like a creature that had been designed specifically for this. "That was not fair," he said. "No," Elena agreed, "it was not. That is also a human tradition." When the exercise was over, the cadre gathered in a loose circle in the gathering dark, and Elena stood before them. She was the smallest person there by a wide margin, and she was the most battered. Her feet left bloody prints on the rock, and her shoulders were bruised. And her hands were raw, but she was standing, and she was smiling, and she said the words that every recruit in Cadre 41 would remember for the rest of their lives. "That is what we are. We do not have scales or shells or wings. We do not have 4 arms or compound eyes or bodies made for crushing gravity. We have spite and stubbornness and the absolute refusal to die. And if you stand with us, we will carry your pack and watch your back and walk beside you until our feet are bone, and then we will crawl." Vorath stood at the edge of the circle and said nothing, and his face was unreadable, but his hands hung at his sides, without a baton for the first time in 23 training cycles, and he did not seem to know what to do with them. The drill instructor broke his baton on her armor. The human said, "My turn." The last 4 weeks of training were different, and everyone knew it, but nobody talked about it directly. Because soldiers do not talk about feelings, they talk about results, and the results spoke for themselves. Cadre 41 became the most cohesive unit the Academy had produced in 6 years. Something had changed on that Highland March. Something had shifted in the way the recruits looked at each other, and at the small human woman who walked among them. The Drethkari no longer called her the charity case. The Paleshi no longer perched above her and watched her with condescending curiosity. The Gorvan no longer moved around her like she was an obstacle too small to notice. They called her Vasquez, or they called her Elena, and some of them called her something in their own languages that did not translate directly, but meant roughly the one who walks when others fall. Vorath was different too, though the change in him was harder to see because he wore it under the surface like a fracture in stone that had not yet split open. He still ran the drills, and he still demanded perfection, and he still punished failure, but the baton was gone. He had not replaced it. The weapon rack in his office had an empty slot where the cerulean baton had hung for 23 years, and he had not filled it, and he did not speak about it. He pushed the cadre harder in those final weeks than he had pushed any cadre before, but the nature of the pushing had changed. It was no longer about breaking them down. It was about building them up. And if anyone had asked him when that shift had happened, he probably couldn't have pointed to a specific moment, but everyone else could. The morning of graduation was clear and bright, and the sky above Cathari Prime was the color of old copper, and the fortress world's twin moons hung low on the horizon like 2 pale eyes watching the hub. Proceeds below. The parade ground had been transformed. Banners of the Galactic Union hung from poles around the perimeter, and rows of seats had been arranged for the military brass who had come from across the galaxy to witness the ceremony. There were Drethkari generals with medals covering their forearm chests, and Paleshi admirals who perched on elevated seats with their crested heads turning to survey the crowd, and Gorvan commanders who occupied reinforced platforms designed to support their enormous weight. In the front row sat High Marshal Savani, the supreme commander of the Galactic Union's combined military forces, a Paleshi of advanced age whose feathers had gone silver-white and whose eyes were still sharp enough to cut. She was the one who had originally opposed human admission to the Academy, and she had come today specifically to see the results of that decision. Cadre 41 marched onto the parade ground in perfect formation, and they were a sight. That made several of the visiting officers lean forward in their seats. 40 recruits of 5 different species moving as one unit with a precision and unity that was visible even from a distance. And at the center of the formation walked Elena Vasquez in her Mark IV armor, polished to a mirror shine, and flanked by Chirrut on her left and Torvon on her right. The graduation ceremony followed its traditional format. Names were called and ranks were assigned, and unit designations were handed out. And when the list of graduates was read, it contained every single name in Cadre 41, a 100% completion rate, which had not happened at the Academy in over a decade. High Marshal Savani raised an eyebrow at that, but said nothing. Then Vorath stepped forward, and the parade ground went quiet, because when a drill instructor requested permission to address a graduation assembly, it meant something significant was about to happen. High Marshal. Honored officers, graduates, I have been a drill instructor at this academy for 23 training cycles. I have trained over 800 recruits across 9 species, and I have broken every single one of them. That was my job, and I did it with pride and without hesitation. He paused, and his red eyes moved across the assembled cadre, and landed on Elena and stayed there. 3 months ago, a human walked onto my parade ground, and I told her that no human had ever graduated from this academy, and that I intended to keep that record. I meant it. I had broken humans before. They are small and soft, and they bleed easily, and they die in conditions that other species consider mild. I saw no reason why this one would be different. He reached behind his back and produced a new cerulean baton, freshly forged and gleaming, and the cadre tensed, because they remembered what that baton meant and what it had done. Vorath held the baton in front of him for a moment. Then he gripped it in all 4 hands, and he broke it over his own knee. The snap of ceruleum echoed across the parade ground, and shards of metal fell to the stone at his feet. And there was a gasp from the assembled officers, because this was not tradition. This was the opposite of tradition. This was a Drethkari drill instructor destroying the symbol of his own authority in front of the entire military command. Private Vasquez did not break when I hit her, Vorath said. She did not break when I denied her sleep. She did not break when I denied her food. She did not break when I denied her credit for her achievements. She did not break when I struck her across the face with my bare hand. And when I brought my baton down on her armor with everything I had, the baton broke, and she did not. He looked at the High Marshal and said, "She broke something in me instead. She broke my certainty that strength is the only measure of a soldier. I have spent 23 cycles teaching that dominance is power and submission is discipline, and I was wrong. This human showed me that endurance is power and compassion is discipline. And the willingness to carry someone else's burden when you can barely carry your own is the truest form of strength I have ever witnessed." He turned to face Elena directly and said, "I formally recommend Private First Class Elena Vasquez for the Iron Crest." The silence that followed was immense, because the Iron Crest was the highest honor a recruit could receive at the Academy. And in the entire history of the institution, it had never been awarded to anyone who was not Drethkari. It was their tradition, their medal, their symbol of warrior excellence, and a Drethkari drill instructor was recommending it for a human. High Marshal Savani stood slowly from her seat and looked at Vorath, and then at Elena, and then back at Vorath, and said, "The recommendation is accepted." And chittering and deep rumbling, and high-pitched calls, and the stomping of feet, and the beating of wings, and Cadre 41 broke formation for the first and only time to surround Elena, and the noise they made was not translatable into any single language, but its meaning was universal. When the noise faded, Elena stepped forward to accept the Iron Crest, a heavy medallion of dark metal stamped with the Drethkari symbol for unbreakable, and she held it in her hands for a moment. And then she spoke. "This does not belong to me," she said, and her voice was quiet, but it carried. "This belongs to Chirrut, who marched on broken legs because I told her she could, and to Torvon, who learned that freezing in fear does not make you a coward, as long as you start moving again. And to Brelt, who carried 3 times his own body weight up a mountain because his squad needed him to. And to Seva, who crossed a ledge above a 1,000-foot drop because she trusted me when I said it would be all right. This belongs to Cadre 41, because they are the ones who decided to follow a small, soft human across a volcano. And that took more courage than anything I did. After the ceremony, when the officers had departed, and the banners were being taken down, and the parade ground was returning to its normal state of gray austerity, Shirik found Elena sitting alone on a bench at the edge of the grounds. The iron crest was in her lap, and she was running her thumb across its surface and looking at the sky. Elena, Shirik said, and the use of her first name was something the Selvari had never done before. I want to ask you something. Ask, Elena said. Were you ever afraid? Elena laughed, and it was the first time Shirik had ever heard her truly laugh. Not a polite sound or a controlled sound, but a real laugh that came from somewhere deep inside her and filled the air between them with warmth. Every single day, Elena said. Every morning when I woke up, I was afraid. Every time Vorath raised his baton, I was afraid. Every step of every march, I was afraid. When I stood in the correction circuit and told him it was my turn, I was so afraid I thought my heart was going to stop. Shirik's compound eyes widened, and she said, "But you never showed it. Not once." Elena looked at her friend and said, "That is the secret, Shirik. We are always afraid. Every human who has ever lived has been afraid. We just decided a very long time ago that fear does not get a vote." 3 months after the graduation ceremony, a classified document was circulated through the intelligence divisions of every major species in the Galactic Union. It was marked with the highest security clearance and distributed to fleet commanders and planetary governors and military chiefs of staff across 1,000 star systems. The document was titled Terran Military Capabilities Revised Assessment, and it was 400 pages long and contained detailed analysis of human physiology and psychology and tactical doctrine and engineering capabilities and historical military records dating back thousands of years. The final paragraph of the document read as follows. Previous classification of Homo sapiens as a Tier 9 negligible military asset is hereby rescinded, effective immediately. All prior assessments based on physical size, individual combat capability, and species lifespan are determined to be fundamentally flawed. Recommended reclassification to Tier 1 strategic significance. Do not engage. Do not provoke. Integrate at all costs. This species does not know how to stop. In the margin of the original copy, written in a rough hand that the intelligence analysts eventually identified as belonging to a Drethkari drill instructor stationed at the Combined Arms Academy on Kethari Prime, was a single handwritten note. I could have told you that 8 weeks ago.